Okay, well, let's get started. Hey, everybody, I'm Michelle Mai with College Planning Source and GradMap. This is Dr. Mike Fino, the Dean of Natural and Social Sciences at MiraCosta College. And I thought it might be helpful for a lot of people to hear about what's happening at the community colleges now. They're starting to offer 4-year degrees at the 2-year community colleges. And Dr. Mike Fino basically runs the biomanufacturing program over at MiraCosta, and I thought it'd be helpful to share some information. So please take it away.
All right, perfect. Yeah, feel free to jump in with questions. So a few things that I want to talk about right out of the gate, which are right in the title of the presentation, which is how are community colleges offering bachelor's degrees? That's new. And what is biomanufacturing? Because that might not be an area that you know a lot about. So I want to talk about those, spend a little bit of time so we feel good about where we're at, what biomanufacturing is, and then what we've done to create an educational program around that to give students access to really great careers working in the biotech industry. So in covering that first piece of how did the bachelor's degrees show up at MiraCosta, that happened through some special legislation in 2014. It was Senate Bill 850 that was approved by our legislature and our governor. And there was 2 key criteria that were part of allowing this pilot program. It was originally just 15 colleges, competitive process to apply for this. And the applications for the proposed programs couldn't duplicate anything at the existing higher education institutions. And there had to be labor market data that supported an unmet need to propose this degree. And so those were a pretty high bar set up for colleges to propose these degrees. And as the biotechnology department, we're originally thinking, well, biotech exists at the CSUs and UCs, but we did have a specialization in biomanufacturing. And as we explored it a little bit more, as I'll describe to you, we found an opportunity to get in there. And this was a growing part of the industry segment in San Diego and in the district that we serve to have effectively a career training program for this part of the industry. The other key piece for that legislation that really got us excited and wanting to be a part of this program was that in that same legislation, it set the tuition total for all 4 years at $10,000. So this was a chance, as we're all observing the costs of higher education growing and growing and growing in recent years, this was a chance to plant our flag at the opposite end of that spectrum and have an affordable education that led to meaningful, well-paying jobs, careers. And so it's something that's has its own story that I'll get to in a little bit. And the further detail on that is a lot of our community colleges, if you don't know, if you're a first-time full-time student, so this is mostly students coming out of high school, we have a promise program that covers the first 2 years of college. So that's 60 units that are paid for. And so that $10,000 quickly goes down to $5,000 or $6,000 to get a bachelor's degree at your local community college. So let me tell you a little bit more about starting to get into, well, what is biomanufacturing? How did we kind of thread this needle? How did we create this degree that wasn't being addressed at the CSUs and UCs? So the first thing is to think about how new products get developed in biotechnology. And we're going to use a therapeutic as kind of a model product. I have another little story to share later to kind of help this all feel a little bit more real and tangible. These products all get discovered at one point in what we call the research phase of the product development. And this is, again, thinking of a therapeutic. This is bringing together information, physiological, medical information about some kind of disease state, what's gone wrong inside the body. And then on the medicinal side, the curative side of it, well, what's the molecule that can come in and interact and disrupt whatever that disease state is to bring about healing or cure or some kind of therapeutic benefit. And so all of that is very research intensive. Those are efforts that are led by MDs and PhDs sometimes MD, PhDs, all in the same person, and clearly within the wheelhouse of our UCs and CSUs in terms of the kinds of faculty that do these things. And invariably, the things that faculty are really good at are their programs of studies and the coursework that they create. So the CSUs have a good handle on the research side of and discovery side of new products and understanding disease and how we might cure and treat them. And what happens after that therapeutic disruptive agent is discovered is that it then works through a stage of development and production. And so in our context, we're talking about a therapeutic that comes from the biotechnology industry. And in large part, those therapeutics are some kind of biological molecule. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more, but it's different from traditional traditional pharmaceuticals, which are these small molecules. But the idea is the same. It is this molecule that it's interacting inside the body and kind of disrupting that disease or alleviating that disease state. Biotech focuses on biological molecules and making more of those and making them at a scale that supports a commercial operation is its own effort, and that's the development phase. So there's two things that are happening in parallel. One of them is that discovery is now ready to start testing in humans, and that's what clinical trials are. Clinical studies go through three phases. You might have seen that in news articles before about new products that are being developed, and those phases have increasing numbers of humans that are involved, and that's all to manage risk because these are new products, unproven. And so it starts with a really small number of people in phase one, larger numbers in phase two, and the large numbers in phase three, sometimes called the pivotal trials. And that's where safety and efficacy are explored for these molecules to support an application to the FDA and ultimately whether it's worthy to be a commercial product and used broadly for, in this case that we're talking about, this example, the treatment of some disease. So in parallel to that is we're figuring out how to make a lot of this material. And that's not a straightforward task, especially in this biotechnology world that has these really complicated molecules, those ones that are interacting with wherever the disease state is in the body. These are complicated molecules. And how you make that from what starts in little beakers to what's eventually in really large tanks takes a lot of concerted effort. And so that's what we start to address in our program at MiraCosta. And then certainly once it's in commercial production, that these batches that are being made on a regular basis support the safety and efficacy that are established when a company applies to the FDA and for it to be used commercially. And so these are areas that just haven't been addressed in a degree before. And we actually met with our partners at Cal State San Marcos, just down the street from us, and connected with faculty at UCSD when we were proposing this degree and to seek out their support, that they agreed that we were complementing them, not supplanting them, that this was not duplicative, but unique and value added in supporting our local industry. And so that's where that's kind of the distinction that we created in developing this degree. And as it turns out, when we first started developing this degree, the first step was to see, well, what else is out there? And it turns out there isn't another biomanufacturing degree in this country. We developed the first bachelor's degree in biomanufacturing. So this was 2014 that we were accepted into this pilot. And at that time, community college baccalaureates are new to California. And, biomanufacturing, still not sure if it's quite a household name just yet, but there are now reports coming out of the White House on biomanufacturing. So that word definitely gets used a lot more than it had in the past. And biomanufacturing was absolutely a part of how this world responded to the global pandemic to develop and produce a vaccine so quickly to COVID. So now let's dig a little bit more into biomanufacturing, kind of giving you some hints in what happens as we're developing a product, and specifically how we differentiated our program from what's happened at the CSUs and UCs. But what is biotechnology and where does biomanufacturing fit into it? And the gist is biotechnology is a really big area. And we focus on therapeutics. Often because that's where our industry's at in San Diego. There's a lot of companies that are developing therapies. Diagnostics are also prominent in San Diego, but there's less that are in these other areas where biotech does play a role in creating products in agriculture, in industrial products that are used to make plastics. And then there's companies that are suppliers that are selling the equipment, materials, supplies that all these companies need to do their work, whether it's research, development, or production. They need specialized equipment and materials. And so there's companies that are there to respond to that and sell them all that equipment. So that's kind of the ecosystem within biotechnology. All of these do exist in San Diego. Those first two are probably the most prominent, and we do have strong suppliers here. If you've heard of a company called Thermo Fisher Scientific, they're a good example in Carlsbad of a supplier. So talking about where biomanufacturing fits within this umbrella of biotechnology, biomanufacturing is about making biological molecules. So that's what the biotechnology industry brought as an evolution of the traditional pharmaceutical. And so to help you all appreciate why a degree might be needed in making biological molecules, a bachelor's degree, but also just to appreciate the difference in what's being produced between traditional pharmaceuticals and what we might call these next generation therapeutics or biotherapeutics. I have an example here. We look at two kind of model molecules that on the left-hand side, aspirin kind of representing traditional pharmaceuticals, what we call small molecules. And on the right side, a biological molecule, an antibody. Antibodies are part of our immune system. And the difference in the size and the complexity of these molecules. So aspirin, relatively small molecule. Other small molecules are a little bit bigger than that. Other examples you might know of are statins, antidepressants. All of those are traditional pharmaceuticals that fall under this small molecule status, and they're made through chemical reactions. So they'll have tanks of all the component materials, and they'll combine some of those materials, bring them up to temperature, expose them to different pressures, whatever the process is. But it's a series of steps, a series of chemical reactions to make that product. Aspirin's as straightforward as that we make that in our own chemistry classes right now. Any college chemistry class, general chemistry, there's a good chance they're making aspirin, just for students to appreciate how that synthesis works. Biological molecules, on the other hand, are much larger, many more atoms, and way more complex than the small molecule counterpart. And so just by analogy, it's the difference between the complexity we might have in making a bike versus, which is the aspirin, versus making an airplane, which is the biological molecule. So this is all to appreciate these are fundamentally different types of molecules that come from traditional pharmaceuticals and what we're talking about making within biotechnology that is part of biomanufacturing. And so the next thing to talk about is what are these biological molecules? And so by far and away, these are proteins that we're talking about. And so proteins don't get the same limelight, so to speak, as DNA. We often hear about DNA and genetic testing or things like that. But proteins are really the workhorse molecule in our bodies. Our enzymes involved in muscles, our hair, the color of our eyes, our immune response, these are all proteins. And that's largely what DNA is a whole set of recipes that are used to make proteins. So DNA, you might remember, makes RNA, and RNA makes proteins. And those proteins are literally a string of amino acids. Again, this is hopefully activating maybe a little bit of high school biology that you have. This is definitely not going to be a scientific talk, so I'm trying to make this as accessible as possible. Maybe get a little dust off your memories of how these things work for those of you that haven't thought about this in a while. But we have 20 different amino acids that are involved in making our proteins. That's what DNA and RNA code for. It tells us that sequence and the type of amino acid that gets added to this string. these beads on a string. And so you can see that in the top right-hand corner, how those beads lead into these other structures that develop. And the reason why that's happening is each of those amino acids has these properties that make them want to interact with or not other amino acids or the environment that they're in. They have charges that are positive and negative. They have like being around to form little spirals, to form little pleats, and for the structure itself to fold up on itself. And so this string ends up becoming, not just one long string, but this folded protein that has at the molecular level a structure. And that structure acts in a lot of cases like a key. And where it's interacting with the body is its lock. And so that protein can slot into some area in our body, and that interaction, that connection, that bond that gets formed has some kind of disruptive effect to that disease state. And so that's the big idea, is that these proteins has a shape, and that shape has a function that usually allows it to interact with something that's important for the state of the disease. So this is now all speaking to that complicated molecule piece that we were talking about. And so one other thought just to share with you, again, because we talked about the small molecules, and we can make those in tanks through these series of chemical reactions. And you're saying, well, why can't we do the same thing with these? Why can't we have, maybe a printer that has 20 different reservoirs with each of the different amino acids, and it's able to assemble this string really quickly and make these molecules? And that's a really fair question. So just a little thought exercise to go through this. So even before getting to that fancy machine, just thinking of each of those amino acids as a Lego block, snapping them together. How quickly could you snap together? How many Lego blocks could you snap together in a second? Maybe if you're super good at Legos, you can do 5. And carrying that through, if you wanted to make something as big as an antibody, which is over 1,300 amino acids, this is going to take you about 4.5 minutes of really intense work, snapping all of these little, if we wanted to assemble these by hand. And again, maybe there's a machine out there that can do this super quick and happen a lot faster than 4.5 minutes. But just hold on to that thought, because it turns out biology, nature, has the ability to do this well beyond anything that we might be able to come up with. So top protein producing cells in our bodies can make 2,000 antibodies per second. So that's all of those 1,300 plus connections are happening inside of a second, and 2,000 antibodies being produced. So that's 2.6 million connections per second to assemble all of these proteins. So even if you had, say, this fancy machine that could do all of this, so this is one machine that can, that we've invested, I don't know, billions of dollars in, that can compete with one cell. But the reality is, when we culture in a biomanufacturing process, these cells that are making these proteins for us, we have over 100 trillion cells inside that process. So take this super fancy machine that can match the ability of one cell. Now we need 100 trillion of those machines. And so all of this is to say, we're not trying to compete with nature. Nature has figured this out. So let's take what we know about nature and harness that knowledge and use living cells to make our products. And so that's what we do is, whatever that novel, that research discovery molecule, which in the vast majority of cases is going to be some kind of protein. We can figure out the DNA code that is the recipe to make that protein. We can insert that DNA into a cell. That's what's called genetically engineering a cell, or making a recombinant cell. And that cell now has the knowledge, has a recipe to make that protein, and we can culture many, many, many of those cells that are going to make many, many, many examples of these proteins. And that's what supports a commercial operation. And so just to get you to appreciate the complexity of this process and how many cells are involved in these. And so a 12,000 liter bioreactor, what's being shown here is the tanks that we grow these cells in. These cells are floating in a nutrient solution That's sometimes called a fermenter, can be called a bioreactor. If you've seen a beer making or wine making a fermenter, it's the exact same idea. These cells are floating in this nutrient solution. Those nutrients provide them with the energy and the materials to make lots of protein. And so we culture them in these bioreactors. These processes can take 14 to 21 days. Sometimes they're continuous. They just happen on a continuous basis. And cells are constantly converting those nutrients into our product of interest, which is some kind of protein. And it's a lot of those cells. And so that's the general idea of what's happening in biomanufacturing. And so just to tell you a quick story about how that's happening in town, Genentech has a $500 million biopharmaceutical production facility in Oceanside. And the very first product that they were making there is a Genentech product called Avastin. And Avastin has a really neat story in terms of its, at the time, this 20 years ago, was kind of the next generation way to fight cancer. And this leveraged the work from a pediatric doctor named Judah Folkman, who many years ago, starting in the 60s, was operating on patients that had cancer. And as he was surgically removing the cancer tumors, he noticed how vascularized they are, how many blood vessels they had. And so I'm not sure if you've thought about a tumor, what a tumor is like in a body. I think some people kind of imagine that it's kind of this large, cold mass, but they're not cold masses. They're filled with blood vessels because blood vessels are what provide nutrients to growing cells. And so that makes sense. These growing tumors, which are a big mass of cells, need nutrients brought to them. They need their waste products taken away. And that's exactly what our cardiovascular system does. And so he asked the question, if you accept the idea where cancer comes from some initial cell that mutated and loses its ability to be a good neighbor and can just grow and grow and grow and grow. He asked the question, well, how does it get the body to bring in more blood vessels so it can get bigger? There must be some way that this tumor is communicating with the body. And that's what kicked off a decades-long search for what that molecule is. And it turned out to be this molecule called vascular endothelial growth factor. And we call it VEGF. And so the name doesn't really matter all that much, but the idea is it's a protein. And when our bodies detect this protein, that acts as a signal to say new blood vessels need to grow towards the source of where that VEGF molecule came from. And that process is called angiogenesis, new blood vessel formation. And angiogenesis has a role in our bodies, certainly when we're growing and developing. It's a big part of our wound healing responses. As we have an injury, new blood vessels will grow into an injured site to bring in white blood cells to help manage infection and deliver nutrients to that wound bed. Weightlifters growing muscle mass will have new blood vessels grow in to support that new muscle. And as it turns out, cancer cells have the ability to secrete VEGF, and that signal to the body is we need blood vessels, and that allows the tumor to grow and grow until it's can choke off the function of other organs and lead to that disease that patients with cancer have. And so this opened the door for a novel therapy. People were reasonably asking the question, well, what if we block VEGF? What if there's some way that we can stop that molecule from having its action? And so this tumor can't even grow. They can't get the vasculature, we can stop that angiogenesis, we can stop that new blood vessel growth. And without the nutrients, that tumor can't thrive. And so that's what Genentech did, was developed an antibody against VEGF. And if you know about antibodies, they're part of our immune system. One of their features, going back to that comment that a lot of our proteins act like in kind of a lock and key format in how they interact with whatever their target is. Antibodies are absolutely the same. They have a structure that acts like a key, and they only interact with very specific targets. And so that antibody very specifically attached to VEGF, but not attached to anything else. And so these are really nice platforms to develop therapies, because one of the ways that therapeutics can go wrong is with what's called off-target sites, where these pharmaceuticals or these biopharmaceuticals are attaching to areas in the body, cells, proteins, organs that aren't intended, and that often leads to safety issues. So the nice thing about these antibodies, the antibody approaches, they very specifically bind to VEGF. And so that's what Genentech did, was develop an antibody, engineered this antibody that wasn't naturally occurring. There really wasn't, in nature, there wasn't a need to have an antibody against VEGF, because VEGF was like its own in-house protein. So it was a novel molecule. It was a new molecule. They created this antibody that attached to VEGF, and once it bound to VEGF, VEGF couldn't perform its function, and so it basically took it out of commission. And so with these antibodies floating around that would bind only to VEGF, take the VEGF out of commission, these tumors weren't able to have this new vasculature come in, and a whole new way to treat cancer was born. And it's not a story that gets a lot of attention now, but if you look at the outcomes for cancer patients over the last 20 years, they've really improved, even longer than the past 20 years. Just the uses of better chemotherapies and for a lot of these biotechnology products have really changed the outcomes for cancer patients. The cure is not there, but there's lots of what we call progression-free survival, and certainly better, higher quality of life for these patients that have cancer. So that's the idea. That's an example. It's happening in town. In this case, the product Avastin was this antibody against VEGF that is used in treating, at this point, dozens of different kinds of cancer. And so where biomanufacturing comes in is making lots of this antibody that would go into a vial, and doctors can inject or infuse it into their patients. And hoping you appreciate the complexity of these products require these very complicated processes that really wasn't the story in traditional pharmaceuticals, and that's what our educational program focuses on. So kind of closing out what made our degree unique, and especially from the CSUs and UCs, but just on its own, it's very interdisciplinary. So biomanufacturing brings together biological, chemical sciences. There's engineering principles that we discuss. There's medical applications. There's business aspects to it. And of course, there's regulatory compliance. Again, especially as we talk about therapeutics, but any kind of product has some kind of regulatory oversight. And that's all addressed as part of our program. And I think that interdisciplinary aspect makes it really interesting and engaging for the students. The other thing that we did, so this is a Bachelor of Science in Biomanufacturing, and what makes this unique from traditional science degrees is that we didn't build it on a calculus backbone. So this might seem strange from someone who developed this degree, who is an engineer that had lots of calculus as part of my education, coming from UCSD, bioengineering, bachelor's and a master's. Lots of calculus, but through 8 years of working in industry in town, the one thing that I didn't use as part of my job was calculus. But what I did use a lot of is statistics and data analysis. And so that's what we built the quantitative backbone of our degree. Is we wanted to build that facility and ease for data analysis, statistical analysis, because those bioreactors that I was showing you that have 100 trillion cells in them, how we monitor that environment is positive, productive for those cells is through lots of probes that are measuring temperature, pH, conductivity, all these different aspects so we know that environment is good for those cells to keep making lots of protein for us. So tons of data is being generated as part of these processes. And we wanted our students to be so good at analyzing that data, because that's how you can see whether things are going to plan or whether there might be a problem with the process and we need to do something to kind of save a batch, for example. The other thing that we do as part of our program is that it's all lab-based. And so I'm not modeling all this that well because I'm here standing and telling you about all this stuff, but that's really not how we do our instruction. There's not a lot of telling our students things. It's our students doing the work. And so we have a lab-based program. Students are doing the science, doing biomanufacturing. They make a protein product in our classes from where the process would start all the way until you get to a purified product that would be ready to go to patients. And so they have that experience built in as part of our curriculum. And so even though they have that experience in our classes, we know there's still nothing that replaces having an industry experience. And so we have very strong partnerships with local biotech companies. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And then the last thing that we do is we bring students in the final 2 years is when they apply for the program. We bring them in as a cohort. And so they take those, what would be junior and senior year classes together with the same group of students. So they have guaranteed classes. All those last 2 years, they take them all together, and there's big benefits to all the support that you get from having those teammates and having that cohort to work through those classes with.
Could I ask a few questions just regarding, yeah, I mean, we have some counselors on here and they're probably wondering about like admission rates into the program. And I think you were saying that there's maybe like 20 or 30 students, 20 to 30 students in a cohort, and they take the same classes alongside each other. Is that correct?
Yeah, so just in the next few slides, I'm going to show you what the curriculum looks like. And so we do divide it between lower division and upper division. Lower division is traditional community college. It's open access. People can take them whenever. We generally have lots of different offerings of all these different sections. And so they don't apply until those second 2 years.
Okay.
So when they're in there towards the end of their lower division, let's just say they're in their last year of taking lower division, in November is when we'll have an application due, and they'll apply to join that cohort to start what would be their junior year or the third year, the upper division coursework the next fall. So they would hear in the spring, and we accept 30 students, up to 30 students in each cohort. And to date, we've hadn't had to place anybody on a wait list or anything like that. The most we've accepted is 32, and we notify them in the late winter, early spring. And so there's a good amount of time before August comes around. We usually lose a handful of students because life happens. And so our average cohort size has been 25. So acceptance rates are, going back to that question, for the most part, if the only reason why students haven't been accepted is they just didn't have the right coursework. So if they have take all the right classes, and we have a dedicated counselor for this program, we connect all our students with the counselor, and she makes sure that you've checked all the boxes. If you have all the courses complete, we have 100% acceptance rate into the program.
Is there a significant number of the students that came in as freshmen that knew that they wanted to go into this program, or are you kind of recruiting, you know what I mean, as you might see some students do well in some of these classes? Just curious how that, yeah.
We have a mix. And so for those of you not familiar with community colleges, they're incredibly diverse in just about any way you want to define diversity, but a big one being just the age of the students. And so we have lots of what we call non-traditional students. They're not coming right out of high school. They've had different lived experiences, different careers even, and they're coming in, and they might even be coming in from another college. Miramar, for example, we act as like a transfer institution from Miramar. They have a biotech degree down there. Those students can transfer over. And so they enter at lots of different places where they found it. Some of them had careers in other areas. Some of them just got referred by a student because they were doing well in a chemistry class, or wondering, I like science, but I don't know what I can do with it. And so it's really varies wildly.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Sorry. Go ahead.
So getting back to what our curriculum looks like, we have, again, the lower division. This is open access, no need to apply. These are all just, these courses might have a prerequisite on them, so you're just taking them in the right sequence. And so these are what the kind of the core classes look like. And the format that we use is 100 level class is generally considered like the freshman year, the first year of college. 200 level classes, sophomore. 300 is junior, 400 is senior. And so these would be like the first year of college. These are the courses that you'd be taking if you were a full-time student. And so you can see the kinds of classes we have. I'm starting to see biotechnology, biomanufacturing industry is very diverse, what these kinds of products these companies are developing. And so they start to see that in that BTech 107 class. And this gets the students thinking about, well, what kind of company might I want to work at? What kind of part of the industry I want to go into? They get that first statistics experience, as I mentioned. There's an overview of the industry, what it means to be regulated by the FDA. And the key course that we have in our curriculum is the basic lab skills class. It's our BTech 110 semester long. Students in the lab 6 hours a week, and they're doing the work. And that's probably the class that's the most transformative in our program in terms of what the students know and can do. And so that's important that that's at the beginning of our program, because one outcome of that class is some students realize I don't like doing lab work. And the best possible outcome is the student finds that this is not the degree path for them. And we built that in, that they find that early. And so this doesn't necessarily mean that they go out of the program, because there's lots of jobs in the biotechnology, biomanufacturing industry that's not doing lab work. And but some of it might be off-putting enough that they really do change majors, and that's totally fine from our perspective. But the idea is that they do start to figure out what they like and don't like, and that helps them navigate, the career that they want to pursue after this. Although I'd say the most common reaction is students love it all, and they just want to kind of experience more and more, and that's what they ultimately end up doing through the curriculum.
Some of the high school students here they'll enroll in community college courses while they're in high school. Is that a course that a high school student could take to, have some exploration, but also get some lower division credits as well?
Absolutely. And some of our classes, we've always had a good number of our classes offered online, even before COVID. Certainly after COVID, we have more classes online. But this is one of them. Any class that has a lab component is always in person. And so this one would be the in-person piece is important. But we'll typically offer that during the day. Every semester we'll have a day offering and a night offering. And so if there was a kind of a motivated high school student that wanted to take it at night, that's an opportunity. If they can free up their schedule, there's a way for them to take it during the day too.
Okay, yeah, that's neat.
Yeah.
Talk to some of the high schools. They'll offer that, and so they all have these like classes and maybe like a medical interventions like track or something. Maybe you guys could try to offer it this course with that to some.
Yeah. The other opportunity there that we're always interested in exploring is what's called dual enrollment, which is offering our college classes at a high school campus. And so we're going to be doing that with Oceanside High School. Or there's what we call articulation, which is your high school happens to have a biotech course. And in that case, we can get that credited for our program. And so that just kind of depends on a case basis. And so if anyone wants to talk more about that, I should say that I'm going to leave my email at the end of this, and I'd be happy to talk with anyone about any aspect of this, including helping build pathways for our high school students, because that's important for us. So last little bit, again, kind of that data analysis piece. I mentioned that's the quantitative backbone in our program. Students have to take a year of general chemistry. If they take AP Chem, we do credit that. They take AP English, we do credit that for English. And so now we start to get into our 200 level classes, and we call these our modules. These are very specialized techniques that are, just kind of help round out the toolkit that our students are exposed to in terms of the types of lab techniques that are done in this industry. And these are all generally 1-unit classes. They take place over 5 to 8 weeks. And just as a great example, our stem cell culture class is 1 unit. That costs $46. And so for $46 in 8 weeks of your life, you can learn to culture stem cells, which is just kind of an incredible opportunity that we have, that I think most people don't really appreciate, kind of the level of sophistication that we have in this program, and certainly with the facilities and equipment that we have. We also have a PCR class for any of you that watch forensic files or pay attention to, crime shows that identify people through their DNA, very small amounts of blood. That analysis is done through what's called polymerase chain reaction. And so students learn how to do that in a class, making those genetically engineered cells that I was talking about, giving them the DNA to make a protein, whatever that protein might have an engineered protein. How you engineer that cell is done through recombinant DNA techniques. We have a class on that. We have some analytical techniques, high performance liquid chromatography, ELISA, which is an acronym. And so those tests are really, if you had a lab test done for COVID, that was probably an ELISA test that was done before all those home tests came out. And then CRISPR-Cas9 is just kind of a next generation recombinant DNA technique that we have for our students. In green are some new classes that we're looking to add. Quantitative PCR is kind of an enhancement, next generation of the original PCR technique. We have DNA sequencers from Illumina. You might know Illumina is a local biotech company, the world leader in sequencing equipment. So students can sequence cells, microbes, anything that we are looking to explore. Flow cytometry is a way to kind of assess the health of our cells. Cells, as you realize, are an important part of these processes, are the ones that are actually making our product. We just provide the environment for those cells to thrive, and flow cytometry is an analytical technique to see how well your cells are doing. So those green classes are classes in the future, but the kind of the capstone class that we have for biomanufacturing are what we call our bioprocessing classes. If you hear bioprocessing, it's synonymous with biomanufacturing. And those classes are broken up into 221 and 222. That matches what the industry calls the upstream part of the process and the downstream part of the process. The upstream is that cell culture piece that's happening in bioreactors or fermenters, as we had talked about. And the downstream piece is, we hadn't spent much time talking about, is okay, so the cells make all these proteins. You're probably appreciating that nutrient solution with those 100 trillion cells and all those proteins is super complex. And how do you get those proteins of interest separated from all that other stuff floating around in there? And that's what the downstream process is. And the short answer is that it's a series of filtration and other technique called chromatography, sometimes centrifugation, is these series of separation steps where we're separating what we want from what we don't want. There isn't any one step that can only grab our protein of interest. There's some steps that are close, but generally it's a series of kind of refining steps, polishing steps to get to eventually a purified solution that's 99.9999% our protein of interest that can then be packaged up and sent off to doctors. In the upper division, this is the part that I said we'd apply to, and so these students would start taking these classes as a cohort. There's two main themes to the upper division. One of them is manufacturing science and technology. How does all this bioprocessing, this biomanufacturing work? How and why do these tanks work? What's all the equipment that's plugged into the tank? What are all these probes, pumps, piping, all that stuff? How did we know to set the pH or the temperature or the the conductivity, the salinity level in those solutions? And how do we measure those? That's what that portion of the curriculum's addressing. And then the other one's the quality and regulatory. What does it mean to make a product that has to be approved by the FDA? What's the FDA looking to in order to initially approve something? And then what does their oversight look like on an ongoing basis? And how do you run what does a quality assurance, quality control program look like in biomanufacturing? So each of those have their own themes. All the courses is kind of in one of those two themes, and each of them you can see ends with their own capstone. For students to really, in large part, see the latest and greatest in what's happening in manufacturing sciences and what's happening in quality and regulation. So there are jobs, plenty of jobs available. This is why we created this degree at MiraCosta. Our district runs from Del Mar up the coast through Oceanside. And this is a little heat map to see the numbers of jobs. And you can see that there's still the history, legacy of biotechnology started as a research industry in San Diego. And that came out of the Bluff in La Jolla, UCSD, Salk Institute, Sanford Burnham. That's where all that discovery happened. But as those products moved from discovery into development into manufacturing, that's where the locations shifted. Initially down the hill into Sereno Valley, and then eventually up the coast, and Carlsbad, Oceanside Vista have large biotech presence, and there's a good amount in Poway and Rancho Bernardo as well. So thriving biotech industry, generally considered to be the top 3 in the country, usually alongside San Francisco and Boston. All that's being changing over time. There's growing areas in Texas and North Carolina too. So for anyone who didn't want to necessarily stay in the area, there's opportunities in these little hubs all across the country. A couple student vignettes to share with you, just to see some of our students and what they're saying about their experience. And this one's Dennis, and I'll let you read his quote. And I just want to share one important thing to highlight that we're highlighting for him and the next student that we have is we design all community colleges. If you have a career education program, you need an industry advisory board. And so we've historically had one. This program has been around since the 90s. At the lower division, it wasn't until that legislation recently that allowed us to develop the bachelor's degree. But even as a lower division program, always had to have industry input. And so we really designed this degree with everything that our industry partners were saying for someone to have a thriving career in this industry. And felt really good about that, really proud about this really unique major, like I was saying, the first one in the country to address this side of the industry. And that was the reaction from our industry partners was, wow, this is the first degree that really speaks to what we do. Everyone else, myself included in my own career, you're mostly trained on that research side of the industry, because if you got a science degree, that's what they focused on. And then you learned all the other stuff on the job. And so this is our students now really hit the ground running. It's kind of a cliche term, but it's really what we've done is they know exactly what that production, commercial, biotechnology side of the industry, how it works, what their language is, what's important to them, what's the important parts of those jobs. And they really are prepared like nobody else for those jobs. So I'm saying all this because in spite of us doing that, we're finding a large number of our students, our graduates, are going on to graduate school. And so Dennis is going to finish his master's degree in bioprocess engineering at the Jefferson Institute for Bioprocessing, which happens to be in Philadelphia. And but they have a remote program where it's largely delivered online, and they go for these 2-week residencies twice a year. So Dennis will finish his master's degree this summer while he's been working in California. And he'll have his master's degree. And then you'll see from Joanna in a little bit the same story. The other unique thing about our program is that we have really probably the best science training facilities, certainly in California, for our program. And so this was originally part of a bond that if you live in our district, voters voted on it in 2016, just under $500 million to really transform our campuses. And we just completed our chemistry and biotech building. Students started taking classes in it this past January. $47 million technology that they get to work with that's really industry grade. These are the same things that they're using when they go out into the workforce. And so we have these dedicated spaces that are redesigned to support the curriculum and for our students to get to experience every aspect of this. And at times in the past, teaching in much smaller labs, there might be students who are working in teams, and a couple of them might just have to watch over someone's shoulder and how something's being done. And that's not what we want as part of our program. We want every single student to get that experience, develop those skills that make them employable and to help them have a great career. And so I mentioned Joanna is another one of our recent graduates, and she opted to go into the graduate program, master's program at Cal State San Marcos. They have a master's in biotechnology. And the other thing that I wanted to say about this, even though we're so proud that this connected with these workplace competencies, for them to get hired and have a great career, in retrospect, it's not that surprising that we're seeing a large number of students go on to graduate school, because this goes back to earlier shared that the legislation set the cost of this degree at $10,000 total. And so what that really means is these students are leaving with no debt. And they're finding that they are enjoying and are being successful at studying this, excited about the opportunities and potential of biotechnology and the potential of themselves. and they want to put themselves on a sharper trajectory to, kind of maximize their career. And so they're opting to get graduate degrees because they don't have any debt. And the idea of taking on some debt, or some of them are working at companies that have really strong tuition reimbursement programs, that their company's paying for a good amount of these. So it's a really nice outcome that we've observed that wasn't part of our initial plans, but it's really great to see. So kind of along the lines of what are some other things that we do to maximize the success of our students in this program? One of them is that we have student organizations of professional societies on our campus. So these three that are listed here, ISPE, PDA, ASQ, these are societies that working professionals belong to. And that's how these are in part networking. A lot of them usually have professional development. You get to hear the latest and greatest from some colleagues. And so there'll be networking and usually kind of informative workshop type things for them to, kind of stay up to date in their field. And we have student organizations of these same ones. And these students go to these meetings where these professionals meet. Sometimes, often as monthly is ISPE, or every other month or quarterly for some of these other ones. So students attend these events, they meet working professionals, they start to realize the value of growing a network. And they also get to exercise some leadership for the students who choose to be officers in these programs. And so what have we seen through all of this? Just about the highest retention rates that we can get. So this means students starting the program that stick with the program. And this is when they apply to the upper division. This is, in those final 2 years. And it is 2 years. And so you'll see 90% graduation rate. But what that means is that we will have, as part of each cohort, students where something happens in their lives, or they just struggle with a particular class and they can't finish one of those required upper division courses. So they'll have to wait till it's offered in the next year. And so that's why we show the 3-year graduation rate. And basically what's being communicated with a 95% graduation rate is that, just about every student that starts this program is completing it. And a lot of that is by design. It's a highly engaging program. The cohort is also its own fulfilling aspect of it. But we also have a dedicated success specialist, sometimes referred to as the mama bear of our cohorts. And she's just actively monitoring all the students. And, if someone's not showing up to class, is struggling with it, she's quick to intervene and help them recover to stay on track. In terms of pay, I have some labor market data. Again, this is part of what we have to do at community colleges, is to ensure that our students can make a living wage in our program. And we have really good data. Students make well beyond living wage. Kind of anecdotally, if someone were to ask me about what do students make coming out of our program, we hear it's about $60,000. And so this data generally supports that students can make more than that coming out of the program, and sometimes students make a lot more than that. And those are especially in these production commercial operations. These are companies that are making money, which is a good thing, and they'll have operations that are running different shifts, and they'll have an opportunity for overtime work. And when students can make time and a half, graduates, I should say, make time and a half, we've had some students reporting, just 2 years out from a degree program making over $100,000. So they do really well. And there's, as I mentioned, lots of jobs in the area. The last thing I want to mention that we do is, and I'd said this earlier, it's a very experiential program. Through the student organizations, we encourage a lot of networking. We have some other mentorship programs that we set up with local industry partners. But nothing beats getting experience working at a local company. And so these internships, apprenticeships are really important to us. Even though our classes, by design are meant to be very experiential, we're still giving those students those experiences to get internships. And how we're doing that is we're pursuing grant funding so that we can pay for students. And so the majority of our students that come through our program get an internship working in local industry, and they get paid while they're doing that work. So we don't have any unpaid internships as part of our program. Most students have access to one of these if they want to. But as you'll see, some of them are already working in industry and they're taking these classes, while they're already fully employed. So the other reason why I like to mention this is, we do still face the stigma of being a community college, offering a bachelor's degree. And there might be some people who have the idea that we're somehow lesser than. But to me, these really validate what we're doing as just as good as any other university college that's offering a four-year degree in the sciences. We have applied for competitive grants in the National Science Foundation, NSF, and we've received those. Another one is the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, known as CIRM. That was a competitive grant process. This is an organization that was funded by California taxpayer dollars to be leaders in stem cell research. And so now that's shifting to regenerative medicine. So there's a biomanufacturing component to this. That grant that we got awarded is $3 million over 5 years. When they announced the 18 institution awards that they were giving as part of that, that included UC Berkeley, University of Southern California, UC Davis, a whole host of CSUs and MiraCostas on that list. And so we are at the table with any other university that you might think is worth its weight in delivering a great science education. We're there with them. And what we're doing with these are National Science Foundation, almost $1.7 million in awards, $3 million, I was saying, from CIRM. The vast majority of that money goes for student wages. And so we're able to approach our industry partners with paid students. And so we create the projects for them. And so this is the whole earn and learn model. And the reason why our students are graduating with no debt, and while we're finding a lot of them are going on to grad school, a lot of them are getting employed. And so for the longest time, we had a 90+% employment rate. That's dipped a little bit as the industry has struggled. We think in large part because of interest rates. Their discovery development is a big part of this industry, before they have a commercial product that's generating revenue. And so we have been hurt with higher interest rates, and the industry is just starting to recover from that. And so this is older data. So I think that, lifetime average of this is going to land somewhere in the mid to high 80s, which again is mostly pointing towards the vast majority of our students. Just about every student wants to work, is getting a job. And also just to illustrate, in our current class that'll graduate this May, a quarter of them are already employed. They started the program already employed. And that's because those classes that we offer in those last 2 years are scheduled Monday through Thursday from generally 9 a.m. to about noon. So no later than noon. And so those students that are listed there have worked out with their employer to shift their schedule so they can get their education and then go to work afterwards. And it's worked for every student that has pursued this opportunity. And we think because it's a technology field, this industry in particular does value continuing education, ongoing education. And so all of these employers have been supportive for these students to shift their schedules so they can get their bachelor's degree while they're working. And so the last thing that I'll mention is community college baccalaureates are really great programs. I personally think we have the best program, but I fully acknowledge that bias. And there are lots of other good programs for potential students that aren't interested in biomanufacturing. I definitely get that's not for, it's going to be everybody's interest, but there it was originally 15 programs around the state. Some follow-on legislation made those programs permanent and allowed the expansion. And so there's 30-something programs now around the state. And if you go to that website, you can see the different programs. And these, are all the most important thing to recognize for these is in order for these programs to have been accepted, they always had that workforce need. So these are programs that are really designed for students to get jobs directly out of college. So that idea of I graduated college, what do I do now? That's not being asked in these programs. They know exactly what they're doing. There's an industry that's been shown that there's a need that are generally good paying jobs. And so for students that have that interest, these are really great programs to consider. And with that, I mentioned I'd share my email address. I'm not the kind of person where you have to think, sorry, I'm bugging you with this. Nobody bugs me. I love talking about this. I'm glad to help you. Anybody in our community, parents, counselors, students, send them my way, and I'm glad to help.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I've actually learned a lot more about biotechnology and kind of separating it from pharmaceuticals to date. And I've talked to you for hours upon hours with this regarding this program. But I'm just so happy to see that, well, you put a lot of time and effort into this over the years, and it's going to help so many, more students to be able to be employed and feel like they're a part of an industry that's innovative and helping people. I think that's a lot of times what we hear from students is they want to do something to help people, and there's a
Yes.
number of ways that they can help people. And so this is what a neat program for definitely an affordable cost. And I think we'll chat more about this, but the goal would be now to kind of share with some of these high school students or any student technically that's interested in this type of program, for them to get some maybe exposure ahead of time. So it's great to know that they could take some of those BTech classes, because I think some of the students who do have a passion for STEM or just science in general, they are looking and to try to find some sort of exploratory, hands-on, project-based type of learning, so that they can see if this would be a good fit for them. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much for your time. And yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye, everybody.